Good afternoon, Anthony. Looking forward to part 2 of our series on Viterol, and we'll venture into the topic of human skin color and Viterol photosynthesis.
Yes. Well, Viterol, formerly known as vitamin D, as we said before, is a confusing phenomenon. You can't really call it a substance. It's more complicated and indeed complex than that, but it's a confusing phenomenon in all of its aspects. And one of the realms of confusion lies in the commonly held idea that under normal conditions, as long as you sun yourself reasonably, you can make ample Viterol in your skin. And it's only under fairly unusual circumstances that you would need to take it orally. And as you and I have been discussing recently, Anthony, it seems more and more with scrutiny that whole assumption is misconceived. And that from the public's point of view, in most countries in the world, it would be better simply to assume that you're not photosynthesizing any Viterol at all and rely on taking it by mouth. That would be the better solution, which we can, the reasoning behind that is something we can discuss.
Yes, I look forward to it because my understanding up until a few days ago was that if you sun yourself for 15, 20 minutes with perhaps your shirt off, you can get up to 15,000 international units of Viterol, formerly known as vitamin D. And that's a decent dose. So why do you think it's more the oral route that's important?
Well, there's all kinds of reasons, starting with the fact that when people say that you just need to take your shirt off and go in the sun, then what they're not telling you is that the sun has to be above 45 degrees above the horizon. And the sun also has to be striking you at a latitude less than 45 degrees north or south from the equator. And that's a lot of caveats. For example, in northern England, you can go out on the brightest summer day in your allotment and garden vegetables with your shirt off for the whole afternoon, and it's perfectly possible that you won't make any Viterol at all, because at that latitude, the sun is never high enough in the sky. So the whole idea that sunshine equals an opportunity to make Viterol is highly, it's simplistic. And there are many other factors involved. For example, in many parts of the world, it's considered infradig to have other than lily white skin. This is true in places like Japan and various other places. So, and in the Muslim world, women are heavily covered. And so there are all sorts of cultural, traditional, environmental, and racial reasons why going out into the sun is not necessarily a formula for vitamin D or Viterol sufficiency. And in fact, the whole simplistic notion that human skin tones across the world have adjusted through natural selection in order to allow the pale-skinned people to synthesize enough Viterol is something that breaks down on closer scrutiny. The pattern is not nearly as convincing as most people think, for all sorts of reasons which we can discuss.
Yeah, no, thanks. Look forward to doing that. Why do you think this notion of get out into the sun and you'll get enough Viterol came about? What was the original foible here?
Well, that's an interesting question. I wouldn't venture an opinion on that. But you see, the context is that there's foibles everywhere, because as we've said, everything about Viterol is confusing. So there's no real anomaly involved. I mean, your ability to photosynthesize Viterol is as confusing as everything else about Viterol. And the reason for that confusion is a complicated syndrome of human misunderstanding, human miseducation, corrupt interests, biological complexity, etc., etc. It's just a tough thing to. It's very difficult to be on top of Viterol in terms of your knowledge enough to know what you're doing. If you put your mind to it, as you and I have, as kind of curious, scientifically minded persons, you can get to grips with it. But the average person does not really stand a chance of doing so because of all the distractions and the confusion involved. And so, ironically, you and I started off criticizing the term vitamin as applied to Viterol, but ironically, I think I and perhaps you have come around full circle to regarding it as more vitamin-like than I originally thought. Because the whole thing about a vitamin is something that you take by mouth in relatively small but crucial quantities. And as it turns out, I'm edging more and more towards the view that Viterol does indeed behave like a vitamin. If you're not getting it in your diet, you're not getting enough of it. And then the complication arises that there's only very few ways in which you can get it in your diet. That's the real thing that people should focus their minds on with intensity, is that it's one thing accepting that you're not going to get it out of sunshine. It's another thing understanding just how difficult it is to get it from your diet, even if you supplement with actual so-called vitamin D supplemental capsules, gummies, or tablets.
Right. Lots of questions come to mind, like why would it be difficult to supplement if you're just popping a pill? But perhaps we can get back to that. A question that I think follows most closely is, well, what about people in the tropics?
Well, you see, people in the tropics
don't they photosynthesize well?
The basic problem with people in the tropics is that they either have dark skin, like the Nilotic Negroes in South Sudan, who are the darkest people in the world.
Yeah.
And or they shelter. For example, in Borneo, people living more or less in and around forests and have long houses and so forth, they stay out of the sun.
Yeah.
For all the obvious reasons. So people either have dark skins or they tend to stay out of the sun, whether by means of shelters or clothing or whatever. And because here's another really important aspect of the confusion. Skin tone seems to be mainly a shield against UVA, the kind of ultraviolet radiation that causes cancer. But along the way, it also shields you from the useful UVB. And so it's very difficult to consider human skin tones across the planet simply in the context of photosynthesizing Viterol, because it's all complicated. And then the whole geographic pattern of skin tones is not nearly as consistent and predictable as people think. And the best example of that is that people at the equator in Africa, the Khoisan people who used to live in Kenya thousands of years ago, had exactly the same skin tone, about 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is lily white and 10 is nearly black, as the Inuit in the Arctic. Now, when you confront that reality, it becomes very puzzling, because at the equator in Kenya, the Khoisan people were basically out in the sun. And it's a tropical sun, and so it should have given them plenty of photosynthetic opportunity. The Inuit not only live in such a dim climate in the Arctic that they never get sun that can give them any Viterol, but they're thoroughly covered up with clothing, and yet their skin tone is brown. What's that all about? So, and you can look for other examples. I mean, for example, equatorial Indonesians are much paler than equatorial Africans. And in fact, the people in the Amazon are also, like the Indonesians, they're just medium brown.
Yeah.
The Yanomami and people like that, they're nowhere near black. There's in the general Oriental group of people, which includes East Asia, the Arctic, and the whole of the Americas, the darkest people are the Inuit, the people who live in a climate which is in which the sun never rises for part of the year. So this whole idea that you can correlate skin tone with Viterol is simplistic to the point of being almost absurd.
And if we make the assumption that dark skins are about protecting from UVA, why the light-colored skins in these people you're discussing at the equator? There's inconsistency there.
Well, there's inconsistency everywhere in this. You
Yeah.
see, people assume that the Celtic people, like the Irish, are pale because they've been through natural selection that then favors photosynthesis of Viterol. But that doesn't really make sense, because you can't really for you to get enough photosynthesis going in Ireland by going out ardently whenever the sun is shining, you'd also get burnt. So and there's no real evidence that you can make any significant Viterol at that latitude and with that sun angle. So nothing stacks up. This whole idea that skin tones are nicely explained by natural selection for photosynthesis of Viterol, it just doesn't hold up. And I think, yeah.
Carry on.
Yes.
Carry on.
No, carry on.
There is a general view that I've picked up that with the COVID virus, that people with dark skins were more vulnerable to it because their Viterol levels were less than those with paler skin. And that's in the northern hemisphere. So, do you think that apparent correlation needs to be questioned? We need to see more data on it, or do you think that maybe there is a hint of pale skins photosynthesizing more Viterol in northern climes than brown-skinned people?
I have no idea what to make of that. I mean, for years now, I have bought into that interpretation, which is that one of the best explanations for the differential effects of COVID-19 on people was a matter of skin tone. But I now just have to throw up my hands and say I just don't understand it, because I've come to question the whole idea that you can efficiently make your Viterol requirements by dermal photosynthesis.
Yeah.
It may well be a cultural thing in which certain ethnic groups in a place like England have different habits of taking supplements of Viterol orally.
Yeah.
But I simply don't know. It's it's a classic case of that wise saying that science is easy with few data. It's very easy to come to conclusions, but when you take a good hard look, they don't really stack up anymore.
So it's perhaps taking us away from the Viterol topic, but and I'd like to return to the question of why you don't think supplements are easy. But the Inuit having a relatively dark skin, do you have some hypotheses as to why? Is it perhaps cultural? And also the difference, the Khoisan on the equator having a light skin, do you think it's a sexual selection thing as opposed to an environmental UVA protection thing?
Well, my ideas on this are not coherent enough to venture an opinion. All I would say is that, as far as I'm concerned, the whole human ecological question of skin tone as explained by environmental natural selection is up in the air for me.
Yeah.
There's too many inconsistencies. I mean, even within Africa is regarded as the birthplace of humanity, but this idea that Africans were originally dark and then went north and got pale in order to photosynthesize Viterol, it doesn't stand up, because you see, the trouble is that in Africa there were not one but two completely different racial groups, namely the Negroes and the Khoisan. And they were both widespread across the continent. The difference being that the Negroes were much darker than the Khoisan. And so how do you figure that out? I mean, and it was the Khoisan, if anyone, who were out in the sun more, because they had a more rudimentary culture, less clothing, no permanent dwellings. And so nothing makes sense with this. So if the Khoisan and the Negroes, being completely different racial groups living side by side in Africa for thousands of years, have recognizably different skin tones, where does that leave us in terms of predicting skin tone from climate?
Seems more random, but there is a maybe this this view that as you go further north, the skin tone is paler, needs to be reassessed. That's my general impression. But
it doesn't stack up in the southern hemisphere either, because when you go to Tasmania, which is it's a cool place, Tasmania. It's as cool as England, and the original denizens, the Aboriginals of Tasmania, were dark-skinned people. Maybe not as dark as Negroes, but they certainly were dark-skinned people. Maybe 6 or 7 on a scale of 1 to 10. And then in Patagonia, the Native Americans in Patagonia were also dark-skinned people. And both were darker skinned than the equatorial Vietnamese, for example.
Yeah.
So within the Oriental racial group, the equatorial Vietnamese are paler than the Arctic Inuit.
No, fascinating. Okay, we're going to leave that question unanswered. What about supplements? Why can't we just pop a pill and be done with this Viterol subclinical deficiency? Why did you hint that that's not easily done?
Well, we're definitely going to have to go into another podcast to explore it thoroughly, because we have limited time. But I'll just touch on what to me is the most interesting and obvious reason. And that is that there's a tremendous psychologically misleading aspect of Viterol supplements.
Right.
Viterol, formerly known as vitamin D3, usually comes in supplements that are calibrated according to an international unit system. And the usual potency or strength of a single unit, be it a gummy, a capsule, or a tablet, is 1,000 international units. And the trouble with this is that implies subconsciously that it's a lot.
Yeah.
When you say 1,000 international units, nobody, unless they're really on the ball, is going to grok the fact that 1,000 international units happens to be an exceptionally small dose, 25 micrograms.
Yeah.
And so, I've suffered from this myself, despite the fact that I'm probably in the top 1% of people educated about Viterol. What one does reflexively is one just takes 1 or 2 units, 1 or 2 tablets, which means 1 or 2,000 international units a day, thinking subconsciously that must surely be enough. Whereas in actual fact, the minimum amount just for normalcy, for restoring normalcy in your vitamin status, not attempting to be super fit or gain superpowers or use it as a panacea or heal from cancer or anything like that, just to get back to biological normalcy, is 6,000 international units per day. Nobody does that unless, like us, they've taken their trouble to educate themselves, and then they almost write it on the fridge to remind themselves, because within a week you're going to forget that crazy thing and you're going to go back to 1 or 2. But each one of us, until we die, are going to have to take 6,000 international units per day just simply to maintain normalcy. That's pretty tough that's a tough, confusing thing for people to get over, right?
Yeah, it's that's 150 micrograms a day, and that sounds like a very small amount, which it is. 150 micrograms is nothing.
It's a tiny amount.
Yeah.
And so one of the biggest culprits, I can't say whether this is advertent or inadvertent.
Yeah.
One doesn't need to invoke malice on the part of the people who provide Viterol in oral supplemental form, but for some strange reason, this crazy labeling system persists. You see, it would be far better for the health of the population if these units, the capsules, gummies, and tablets, were labeled as, say, 0.25 international units, because then the natural reflex would be to take, say, 5 of them to come up to 1 international unit.
Yeah,
that'd be the simplest possible way to exert beneficial persuasion on the population. If the interests concerned actually had public health in mind. They would change that international unit system overnight because it's very, very misleading, to the point that it generally results in the public underdosing with oral Viterol by a factor of at least 5.
Yeah.
And usually more than 5, because even if you take 1 or 2 every time you take them, you don't generally remember to take them every day. So what happens is most people in Western societies don't take anything at all. Those who do take maybe 1 or 2 thousand international units a week. Some, maybe 20% or 10% take 1 or 2 thousand international units a day, and only the maniacs like you and me who've spent weeks researching it ardently have finally realized that we've got to take 6,000 international units every day just to be normal.
Yeah.
that's some powerful juju there, if you want to.
Yeah. Another way would just be to sell the pills with 5,000 international units in them and not have the 1,000 units. That's a bit odd. Yeah.
Well, that is right. That is right. Yes.
Mm.
Apparently, you can take 300,000 international units once every 3 months.
Yeah.
And never risk overdose.
Yeah. Similar to yeah. And those amounts are given to livestock as well, as I understand, routinely.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Anthony. I really enjoyed this opening up of more questions. Confusing topic, and our role here is simply to put the questions on the table and not necessarily provide answers, but just finding the question is enjoyable. Thanks very much.
Yes, well, I look forward to our next podcast on this topic. I think there's quite a few podcasts left in the topic of Viterol, formerly known as vitamin D. And until then, to listeners, like, subscribe, and share, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And
Great.
over and out for us.
Over and out. Thanks.